This title is, the title of this presentation is Don't Think for Yourself, Philosophy, Authority, and Belief in Three Medieval Cultures. And the three medieval cultures in question are the Islamic world, Jewish philosophy, and Christian philosophy. And I will have the most to say about the Islamic tradition, somewhat less about Judaism, and the least to say about Christianity, which is kind of an inversion of the way people usually think about medieval philosophy. And I'll say something about what medieval philosophy is in a second. But first, I just wanted to introduce the kind of philosophical theme of the talk, which is authority and belief. And the reason that I'm interested in thinking about this is because I think all of us face a problem these days, which is that we seem to be required to outsource the job of forming our beliefs to other people. So if you think about something like the debate over climate change, probably a lot of you have an opinion about climate change, but I'm guessing that no one here is an actual climatologist. Any climatologists in the house? No, okay. So, but we all at least admit that climate change is an important phenomenon, assuming it is a phenomenon, and we have beliefs about it despite not having any expertise about the climate. At least I don't have any expertise. And of course, you can run right through pretty much all of the political problems that we face today and controversies. And if you think about them, you'll see that to understand any one of them really deeply, you would probably need to have a PhD in the relevant field, and maybe that wouldn't even do it. So for example, people often complain that even economists don't really understand the implications of, I'll go ahead and say it, Brexit. So clearly this is a problem, and we're all in the situation of kind of deferring to experts to form our beliefs about important matters. And this is causing a lot of political upheaval at the moment, right? It's because there's a lot of debate about the circumstances under which we should be doing this. So we have all these debates about fake news, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really why I'm thinking about it. But I do also want to stress that this is not only a political issue. So an example that I was thinking about recently is that I live in Munich, and in Munich people get everywhere on bicycles, right? It's sort of like Cambridge, except that everyone's speaking German. And I was riding my bicycle behind my wife, and we got to a street, and she paused, looked for cross traffic, and then went across, right? So I'm kind of coasting along behind her, and I think, well, she wouldn't go across the street if there was a car coming, so I actually don't have to check, right? I can just go across myself. Like I can literally just ride across the street, literally risking my life, and on the bet that she's checked to make sure that there's no traffic coming. So I mean, I checked anyway, but the point is that I would have been sort of perfectly happy to ride across, even just because my trust in her judgment is so deep. In fact, I trust her judgment a lot more than I trust my own judgment. I'm a philosopher, right? And if you think about it, you kind of go through life all the time doing this, right? So how do I get to Charing Cross Station from here? You ask someone, they tell you, you just sort of without thinking, you just do whatever they told you to do. You realize they may not be giving you good advice, but you sort of assume that they do unless given a good reason to distrust their advice. And this is, of course, something that contemporary epistemologists think about a lot. It's sometimes called the problem of knowledge by testimony. So a really clear example would be something like, Fariel has seen something happen, I wasn't there, so I just asked her what happened, right? So that would be a literal case of testimony. But there's a more general phenomenon, as I say, which plays out on many, many levels, the political, the personal, the practical, which has to do with this way of forming beliefs where someone else tells you what's true and you just believe it because they say it's true, okay? And if you think about it, this is both natural and necessary on the one hand, and on the other hand, kind of suspect. Because usually we think that we should form our beliefs on the basis of understanding why the thing we believe is true, right? So for example, if we talked to a physicist and they said, well, I believe that you can create power using nuclear fission or fusion, whichever the one is that they know how to do. And you say, oh, well, how do you know that? And they just said, oh, well, my friend's physicists tell me this, other physicists. You would think, oh, okay, well, they don't actually know what they're doing, right? So you would be, oh, not a real expert. And if you were really strict about it, you might think that actually you should only believe things that you know for sure are true, right? Especially if you were a philosopher, you might think that. Especially if you were an ancient philosopher, you might think that. So there was actually a school of philosophers, the Stoics, who literally said this. So they said that the perfect philosopher, the Stoic sage, is someone who never makes any mistakes, and if they're not sure what to believe, they withhold belief entirely. So they only will commit themselves when they are absolutely certain. And there's a nice example of this, a kind of funny anecdote about a Stoic philosopher named Sphaerus, who was given a plate with fake fruit on it, made of wax. And he picked up this wax apple and bit into it, and everyone laughed. And they said, ah, ha, 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 see, you're not a very good philosopher because you formed the belief that it was an apple. And he said, no, I formed the belief that it would be reasonable to suppose that it was an apple. And that's the basis on which I tried to bite into it. I knew it might not be an apple, right? So maybe give him points for quick thinking, at least. And one result of that is that this other group of philosophers, the Skeptics, came along and said, well, if you have the policy that you should only form your beliefs when you're absolutely certain, then you should never form any beliefs at all because you can never be totally certain, because the apple could always be made of wax, and there's always some equivalent, right? So when you think you're having coffee with your friend, as far as you know, your friend has an identical twin that you're not aware of, and the friend couldn't make it, so the friend sent their identical twin to meet you so that you wouldn't be offended, right? You can always make up some story. By the way, I have an identical twin, for real, so you actually don't know that I'm talking to you right now. Google him, he really exists. I mean, don't Google him now, Google him after the talk. Right, so this issue about whether or not to form beliefs on the basis of authority is relevant to what I just said, because of course the Stoics would say no, at least if you're trying to be a Stoic sage. Of course you shouldn't believe something because someone else says it, that is true. You should only believe it because you're a philosopher and you figured it out, right? Now, here's the surprising fact of which I want to convince you in the rest of this talk. You might suppose that the least productive period in the history of philosophy to think about this issue would be medieval philosophy, because we tend to have a kind of prejudice about medieval philosophy, which is that it was extremely authority-bound, very uncreative, no innovation, because they were in the habit of following previous authorities, like, say, Augustine, or even just the Bible. We might even think, oh, well, if they dared to be innovative, they would get in trouble. So, of course, they were very authority-bound. So here we have a culture that's like doing very badly at thinking critically about the nature of authority. But actually, that's not true at all. That's really what I want to convince you of. So in all of the medieval cultures in the Islamic world, in Latin Christendom, also in Greek Byzantium, they paid a lot of attention to the phenomenon of authority, precisely because authority was so important in their cultures, right? So their cultures are obviously very committed to revelatory traditions, which are a kind of authority, and they also have these very long-running, stable textual traditions with many important authors who were considered to be authoritative, like Augustine, as I just mentioned, or Aristotle. So they tend to do philosophy by engaging with authoritative texts and creatively working within the spaces left open by those texts, rather than doing, say, what Descartes did, which is to pretend that he was just starting from scratch and then actually repeating a bunch of arguments he got from the medievals. But the rhetoric of Descartes is, I made this all up by myself. I was just sitting in an easy chair, and here's what I came up with. Whereas the rhetoric of a medieval philosopher is, oh, I'm not saying anything new. This is all like well-worn wisdom. And Descartes is a lot less original than he's pretending to be, and the medievals are a lot more original than they're pretending to be. And that, what I just said really especially goes for the Latin Christian tradition. So this is how scholastic philosophy especially works. But first, surprising thing, in the Islamic world, this looks rather different. And I guess any specialist on medieval philosophy who starts thinking about this issue will probably quickly think of the fact that whereas philosophers in the Christian worlds tend to be, at least in their rhetoric, fairly authority bound, there are quite a few philosophers in the Islamic world who are ostentatiously innovative and make a big deal about the fact that they're just following their own reason where it leads, even to the point that they're not necessarily following a revealed tradition at all. So they have a tendency to treat philosophy as this kind of autonomous field of inquiry, which confirms religious revelation, but is not dependent upon it. And this is actually another one of the things I've been thinking about recently, which kind of led me to come up with this talk. Why is it that we have these very hardcore rationalists who tend to be Aristotelians in the Islamic world, and we tend not to have it in Latin Christendom? So at least the rhetoric is different. So the rhetoric of your standard Aristotelian philosopher, like for example, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, to name a few people you may have heard of or may not. Whereas they say, oh, we do everything with just pure reason. We think for ourselves, right? We work it out, and then we write down what we figured out in the form of proofs. Most people don't do that, but we do. That's the kind of authorial posture of one of these Aristotelian philosophers in the Islamic world, whereas the posture of a scholastic philosopher is often, well, I'm just trying to explain our theological commitments that we got from this long-standing religious and scholarly tradition. So a question is, like, where did the Islamic Aristotelians get this? Where did they come up with this posture? So I started looking into this and came up with a surprising, or what I think is a surprising explanation, which is that although they may have gotten it partially just from Aristotle and the idea of having a purely rational science, which is certainly something you can find in Aristotle, they also got it by looking at what else was going on in their own culture and observing that Muslim jurists and theologians had come up with a very similar idea. So to explain this, I need to introduce a little bit of Arabic terminology, but I only need to learn 2 words if you don't already know Arabic. One is taqlid, and the other you may have heard of or almost have heard of, which is ijtihad. So taqlid means, well, it's actually not that easy to translate in one word, but it means something like uncritically accepting authority. So you can see why I'm interested in this, right? This is, in a way, the topic of my talk. And it's great that they have a word for this. It would be great if the word taqlid became an English word. So maybe start using it, over in dinner parties. Oh, that's a terrible example of taqlid. And in fact, it was usually used as a term of criticism, if not abuse. So if I say, you're engaging in taqlid, what I mean is you haven't thought this through for yourself. You only say that because you're following an authority or a tradition. So that's one of the 2 words. The other word is ijtihad. And the reason that may sound kind of familiar is that it's etymologically related to the word jihad, which of course means effort or struggle. And it can, but need not be, a military struggle. So ijtihad means just making an effort. And ijtihad is effectively the antonym, or at least the partner contrast term, to the word taqlid. So if I engage in ijtihad, what that means is I've thought about it for myself and I've figured it out. And someone who engages in taqlid is called a muqallid. Someone who engages in ijtihad is a mujtahid, just in case I need to use those forms of the words. Okay, so why is this relevant? Well, if you look at the legal tradition in Islam, and there's a lot to say about how Islamic law works, but you don't really need to know about it. The point is that there are all these Muslim jurists who, beginning pretty early on, and in fact around the same time as people start writing about philosophy in the Islamic world, they start systematizing Islamic law on the basis of the revealed tradition. So obviously the Quran, but also the Hadith, which are reports about things that the Prophet said and did. And the question very quickly emerges, what does it mean to make a legal ruling in this context? And they come up with the idea that there's two ways of doing it, namely through taqlid or through ijtihad. So taqlid would be, I'm a member of a legal school, and I just say whatever my master said, or whatever other members of the school have said. So, for example, if I'm trying to make a ruling in an unclear situation, then rather than sort of sitting down and trying to figure it out, I just see whether I can find someone else who's already pronounced on the issue, and if I can, and I consider them authoritative, I just make that ruling. And the other option, of course, is ijtihad, and this is where the mujtahid says, no, I'm competent enough as a jurist that I trust myself to go back to the sources myself. I'm really familiar with the Quran and the Hadith, these collections of sayings about the Prophet, and so I will make my own ruling on that basis. And there are different legal schools in the Islamic world which are founded by people who are considered to be mujtahids. So like there's this there's this jurist named Shafi'i, who's the founder of the Shafi'i legal school. And he's considered to be someone who was capable of doing this, coming up with like innovative new rulings, obviously not just on the basis of his common sense or his intuitions, but on the basis of the sources of Islamic law. And what's interesting about this is that these jurists divide the juridical world into two kinds of jurists. The really awesome ones, they didn't use the word awesome because they weren't American, but the really awesome ones who are the mujtahids, and everybody else who are the muqallids. Actually, they have a somewhat more refined way of thinking about it than that even, so they will sometimes say that there are the pure mujtahids who really start from first principles and figure out everything on their own. And then there is the so-called mujtahid within a school, which means, for example, I consider myself to be a Shafi'i jurist, so I figure it out, but by following the principles laid down by Shafi'i and his followers, right? So that's kind of a compromise between pure ijtihad and pure taqlid. And then importantly, a lot of kind of just everyday jobbing judges who have to make everyday rulings, they can, and in fact should engage in taqlid, because we don't want them just making stuff up all the time, right? Because we don't really trust them to do it. And all the more so, everybody else, right? So hoi polloi, by the way, folks, don't say the hoi polloi, because hoi means the in Greek. So you don't ever say the hoi polloi, that means the many. Just say hoi polloi. Okay. If you learn one thing tonight, actually, let it be that. So now you've learned some Arabic and some Greek. Okay. Anyway, so hoi polloi, the non-jurists, the people who aren't trained in jurists, should obviously only engage in taqlid at least when it comes to law. And all these ideas emerge very early, like in the 8th and the 9th centuries, just when Aristotle and other philosophical texts are first being translated into Arabic. Then these ideas come into theology, or as it's called in Arabic, Kalam. And the theologians, the mutakallimun, make a very similar distinction. And they're really interested in the question of whether Muslim believers and professional theologians or expert theologians should be engaging in ijtihad or taqlid. And a very common thought is that the expert theologian is precisely the person who engages in ijtihad, so who makes an effort to, for example, prove the existence of God through a rational argument, rather than just believing it because the Quran says so, or who has certain views about God's nature or the nature of prophecy, etc. The theologian is able to give you a good reason for believing in these things, whereas the non-expert theologian, i.e. the normal person, i.e. hoi polloi, i.e. 99.99% of the population, is supposed to engage in taqlid, right? Because again, we don't want them just making stuff up. Like what if they try to prove the existence of God, can't do it, and they become an atheist? That would be bad. But amazingly, there are quite a few theologians in the Islamic world who disagreed with this and who said that even the humble believer should engage in a limited amount of ijtihad, like they should at least be able to understand a good basic argument for the existence of God, for example. Why? Well, first of all, because it would make their beliefs secure, right? So if I'm a theist, I don't want to be vulnerable to someone who comes along and challenges my belief in God, right? I want to be able to hold on to it. So that's one reason. But I think there's a more interesting reason. And to illustrate this reason, I want to read you a passage from a great Muslim theologian named Al-Ghazali, who is admirable in many ways, but one of them is the year that he died, which is 1111. This is the easiest death date to remember in like the entire history of philosophy, so we really owe him for that. Although, of course, he died in 1111 on the European Christian calendar, so he didn't know that he was doing us this favor. But anyway, here's something that he wrote in his autobiography, which is called The Deliverer from Error. Thirst for grasping the true natures of things was a habit and practice of mine from early on in my life, an inborn and innate tendency given by God in my very nature. He's very humble, Ghazali. So as I neared maturity, the bonds of taqlid, so uncritical acceptance of authority, weakened for me, and I was emancipated from inherited beliefs. For I saw that young Christians always grew up to accept Christianity and young Jews to accept Judaism, while young Muslims always grew up to accept Islam. And I heard the hadith, so a report, related of the Prophet, every child is born in the innate condition, but his parents make him a Jew or a Christian. So this, I think, is actually a different worry than the worry about keeping your beliefs stable. The worry here is that if you believe by taqlid, then your beliefs will only be as good as the authority you're following, and the authority might be wrong. So suppose that you're Jewish, well, then you'll follow Jewish tradition and Jewish authority, which will get you part of the right answer because, for example, you'll be a monotheist. So that's good, Ghazali would say. Sadly, you'll reject the prophecy of Muhammad, which is really bad. And the fact that you're a Jew rather than a Muslim is just luck. So nowadays, philosophers might call this epistemic luck. So you only have the beliefs that you have because you were born into a situation or grew up in a situation where the available authorities believed such and such a thing, so you wound up believing it. So it's almost like the fact that a medieval person is rich or poor would be a matter of luck. Their wealth in terms of truth or poverty in terms of falsehood would also be a matter of luck. And this is, of course, very disconcerting. So that's why Ghazali is saying here, I rejected taqlid. I decided to figure everything out on my own. And then the rest of his autobiography explains how he did that. So this shows not, by the way, that he thinks everybody should do this. In fact, he wrote another work saying that it's very important that normal people do not try to depart from taqlid because they'll go astray. So as far as he's concerned, the people who have been lucky enough to be born Muslim should just go with it in most places, unless they belong to this independent-minded intellectual elite, in which case they should engage in rational reflection, prove everything for themselves. Now let's go back to the philosophers. So the philosophers come along in the train of this line of thought, and I want to say that, and this is of course very ironic, their posture of supreme, independent, purely rational philosophy, completely freed from the bonds of religious devotion, albeit always in agreement with religious devotion, that itself, I want to say, was borrowed from the juridical and theological tradition. So, for example, when one of Ferriel's favorite philosophers, Averroes, whose real name was Ibn Rushd and lived in Islamic Spain in the 12th century, when he writes a work called The Decisive Treatise, Fasl al-Maqal, in which he says that the people in the best position to understand the Quran are philosophers, because philosophers have an independent, rational way of securing truth through demonstrative proofs. So they already know what's true independently, so they can tell you what the Quran must mean, because it's true, right? So there's always interpretive problems about what the Quran means, and since they already know what's true, they can check every interpretation against their philosophical demonstrations. When he says that, he's actually recapitulating a way of thinking about rationality, which was already well established in juridical and theological traditions, which he knew very well. In fact, his grandfather, who was also named Ibn Rushd, wrote works on law in which he actually gives a taxonomy of different kinds of mujtahids and muqallids, which exactly corresponds to Averroes's sort of contrast between philosophers and theologians and common people. So I think this is actually really cool because it's so ironic, right? That as I say, the purely rational posture of the philosophers is itself based on something that was going on outside of philosophy. But as cool as this is, I think it's also kind of unsatisfying. What I mean is that it's philosophically unsatisfying, partially because it's obviously like insanely elitist in a way that's rather unattractive, right? So there's some people who figure out everything, at least everything important for themselves, and hoi polloi, not the hoi polloi don't figure anything out for themselves when it comes to these important matters, or maybe they figure out a few little bits, but basically they just follow the opinion of the experts. So that elitism is unattractive. Maybe it's not so surprising. I mean, if you're living in a time where the vast majority of people aren't even literate, then you might be very pessimistic about their ability to form their beliefs through anything like a kind of rational form of expertise. But I still think the elitism is rather unattractive. But also just like epistemically, as I've already said at the beginning, it doesn't really seem like a good option for us to form all our beliefs on the basis of our own effort, right? So as I said at the beginning, like, do you really want to have to get a PhD in climatology before you can vote in an intelligent way when it comes to climate change? Probably not. And even if you did, then you'd only be an expert on climatology. What about all the other stuff, right? I mean, what if you're trying to figure out, like, there's 5 Shakespeare plays, which I don't have time to go see all of them, which one should I go see, right? Do you really have to go, like, quickly do a BA in English literature so you know which play? No, you have to trust the views of experts, right? So in general, if the message is, well, either figure it out for yourself or you're a loser, is not a good epistemology, in my opinion. So in other words, it's not a good theory of belief formation in this context. What would be a better answer? Well, surprisingly to me, and I say surprisingly because in general he's not one of my favorite philosophers, but surprisingly a very good answer to this can be found in Al-Ghazali. I can tell you later why I'm not a big fan of his, but on this he's really good. So I'm going to give you another quote from the same work, his autobiography. So he's talking here about how to convince yourself that someone is a prophet, in particular that Muhammad was a prophet. And he says, if you're in doubt about whether a certain person is a prophet or not, certainty can be had only through knowledge of what he is like, either by personal observation or reports and testimony. If you have an understanding of medicine and jurisprudence, you can recognize jurists and doctors by observing what they are like and listening to what they had to say, even if you haven't observed them. So you have no difficulty recognizing that Ash-Shafi'i, who I mentioned before, was a jurist, or Galen, a major medical authority of antiquity, was a doctor. This being knowledge of what is in fact the case, and not a matter of taqlid shown to another person. Rather, since you know something of jurisprudence and medicine and you've perused their books and treatises, you've arrived at necessary knowledge about what they are like. Likewise, once you grasp the meaning of prophecy and then investigate the Quran and the Hadith extensively, you arrive at necessary knowledge that Muhammad is at the highest degree of prophecy. So here's what he's saying here, I think. And let's actually leave the prophecy case out because that's kind of complicated. Let's focus on the parallel that he draws, which is in a way more useful for us, which is to jurisprudence and medicine. So what he says is, you don't need to be a super expert in jurisprudence and medicine to recognize a competent jurist and or a competent doctor. You just need to know enough that you're in a good position to identify the competent ones, and then you can follow their advice. So the thought here is that you do have some responsibility for figuring out which authorities to follow, but the responsibility doesn't rise to the level of actually becoming an expert yourself. So to take the climatology case again, you don't need to have a PhD in climatology. What you need is enough understanding of how climatology might work and how science works generally to be able to tell good climatologists from bad ones. And maybe, they went to good universities, they have PhDs, maybe they agree with other climatologists, most of them. That might be a good criterion to use. But there will be some criteria, whatever they are. And by using these criteria, you can say, yes, I will believe what you say, or this group, I will believe what this group says. I will outsource my beliefs to them, but not just willy-nilly, in a responsible way, by at least finding out enough about the subject that I know whom to trust. And I would call this justified taqlid. So it's like a compromise between absolute taqlid and absolute ijtihad, where I don't go so far as to figure everything out for myself, like Averroes would tell you to do, nor do I just follow whichever authorities have kind of been handed to me, because then I'll fall into the problem of epistemic luck, right? I'll just wind up believing whoever was kind of put in front of me. Rather, I'll be critical about which authorities to believe, and then having been critical enough to figure out which ones are the right authorities, I'll have a good shot, at least, at having true beliefs. That's the solution. And I think this is exactly right, actually. So I think this is the right way to form our beliefs in response to expertise, which, in a way, is what I wanted to say. But I also wanted to reflect on how these issues look in at least some texts from the Jewish and Christian traditions, but this won't take too long. So I'll probably talk for another 10 minutes or so. Okay, so someone I want to focus on from the Jewish tradition is a philosopher named Judah Halevi, who actually also lives in Islamic Spain, like Averroes. A lot of important medieval Jewish philosophers lived in Spain under the reign of Islamic leadership. And Halevi actually read works by Ghazali and may have been influenced by him. And he wrote an amazing book, which is called the Khuzari. And it's about a real historical event, which he's kind of reimagining in very freely fictionalized terms. The real historical event is that there was this people called the Khazars who lived in Central Asia, whose leaders converted to Judaism in the early medieval period. And Halevi knows about this story, and so he imagines the king of the Khazars trying to figure out which religion to believe in. So the king interviews a Muslim and a Christian and a philosopher. Interestingly, philosophy here is put on a par with a religion, right? And he's unsatisfied by what they all say. Actually, what he says about Christianity is really interesting. He says, if I had grown up believing these things, then I might be able to believe them, but having not grown up with them, I have no chance, because they're too absurd, like that God is 1 and 3, or that God became a human. Like, maybe you can believe this, but I can't, sorry, I've already grown up. Which is a really good example of this thing about epistemic luck, right? So the reason why Christians can believe these absurd things is because they grew up Christian. But it's too late for me, so to speak. And so anyway, he doesn't find the speeches of the philosopher, the Christian and the Muslim convincing. And so kind of in desperation, he turns to a Jewish rabbi and he says, well, you Jews are like really despised and everyone thinks that you're rubbish, but I don't know who else to ask anymore, so you tell me what you have to say. And then the rabbi converts him to Judaism in like 2 pages. It's like, bam. And then, so that's like only the first maybe 5% of the text, and the rest is him learning from the Jewish rabbi about all these teachings about miracles and prophecy and whatnot. So what's interesting about this, first of all, is just the fictional setup, because you can see that in a way it exactly depicts this structure of justified taqlid that I was just talking about. So the thought is that the king is doing what he should as a responsible believer, which is not to go off and become an expert philosopher or theologian. It's to find some experts, assess their apparent expertise, and go with the one who seems to be best qualified, right? So for example, he doesn't say anything ridiculous like the Christian does. He also doesn't say anything that the king is not in a position to evaluate. He says something else interesting about Islam, which is that the central miracle of Islam is the Quran, which is supposed to be so beautiful and perfect that no human could have written it. And the king says, well, that's very nice, but I can't read Arabic, so I'm not really in a position to evaluate this claim. Whereas the Jew says, oh, well, Moses parted the Red Sea, and there are thousands of years of testimonies passing this information on. It's very, very well attested, and there were thousands of people there who saw it. So like, this is a really, really well-founded miracle, so you should believe it. And this the king finds persuasive. So now I don't want to claim that you should all become Jews. That's not the point. All I'm saying is that what Halevi does here is to show someone converting to Judaism for good reasons while still following an authority, namely this rabbi who's the real expert. And so Halevi has really like ingested this message that this is how responsible religious belief at least could look. And then I wanted to mention like a philosopher I'm sure you would have heard of, namely Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century in Paris, well, Italy and Paris, and who gives us a way of thinking about philosophy and its relationship to religion, which again is structurally very similar. So if you think about the revealed theological tradition as a kind of authority, Aquinas says that our responsibilities as rational believers with respect to this theological tradition is to try to understand it as well as possible and to work out potential, like learn how to deal with potential objections to it, and also sort out any apparent contradictions. So for example, he has like a very complicated way of explaining the Trinity. He has a very complicated way of explaining the Eucharist. So he uses rational reflection to try to understand these things. But fundamentally, theology is where we start from, but it's not where we finish. So he says that just as, for example, geometry presupposes certain axioms and then goes from there, it's like sort of derives further theorems from them, so we as Christian philosophers presuppose the truth of theology, which we believe for good reason, but not because we figured it out for ourselves, rather because it's authoritative. And then on the basis of this authority, we derive the rest of philosophy. So it's like at the top. And again, I think that when philosophers nowadays contemplate this way of acting, they might think that this looks rather suspect, right? Because it sounds like Aquinas is sort of assuming all the most important stuff from the start. So he's just assuming Christianity is true and then doing philosophy within this context. But actually, I think Aquinas is being very careful to be rational because he's thinking about theology as a kind of starting point for philosophical rational reflection, rather than thinking about rational reflection as the only kind of instrument we have for forming our beliefs. Rather, you use reason to assess what's available as an authority. You establish that it's an authority worth accepting, and then you submit to it. And that's really the important difference. So the difference between the radical Aristotelian philosophers like Farabi and Averroes in the Islamic world, and all of these other people like Ghazali, Judah Halevi, Aquinas, the difference is that the radical Aristotelians refused to just submit to some authoritative source of belief. I seem to have said something wrong. They're coming to get me. I'm going to have to finish up very quickly before the cops break in. So the radical Aristotelians would tell you that you should not outsource your beliefs. You should not submit to an authoritative source of belief because you can do better than that, at least if you're a potential philosopher, if you're a member of the intellectual elite. And as I say, they actually got that idea from a bunch of non-philosophers, from a bunch of jurists and theologians, which is, as I say, quite ironic. that's their position, but that's not the mainstream position in medieval philosophy. The mainstream position in medieval philosophy is that you should critically accept an authoritative source of belief, believe it, and then go from there. Maybe reflect on it further, as Aquinas says, but you shouldn't try to think for yourself, at least not if that means only thinking for yourself and trying to figure everything out. And what I think is really salutary about this story that I've told you is that when modern day philosophers look back at medieval philosophy, they're liable to pick out these radical Aristotelians who lived in the Islamic world as kind of the most admirable figures because they were the most rational. But actually, at least in terms of the structure of how belief works and should work and must work, in a way, these more moderate figures who advised us to engage in what I'm calling justified taqlid had it right. Thank you very much.